What if I told you that the single greatest threat to America isn't a foreign army or a new pandemic, but a ghost, a financial specter that has haunted and slain every single superpower in history? This is the darkest story our money can tell. Within the next minutes, you will see the invisible trap that every empire walks into, a blueprint of collapse so consistent it borders on prophecy. And by the end, you will know exactly where we are on that deadly timeline and what the final act looks like. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Let's begin where the pattern was first written in fire and stone, ancient Rome. Close your eyes and picture this. You are a Roman legionary stationed at Hadrian's Wall in the bitter cold of Britannia. You've just spent 20 years defending the empire's frontier, fighting Pictish tribes, enduring disease and hardship. It's payday. The quartermaster hands you a leather pouch, heavy with coins. You pour them into your calloused hand. They are denarii, the same coins that have built the roads you march on, the aqueducts that bring water to your cities, the very symbol of Roman power. They bear the face of the emperor, solid, trustworthy. But something is wrong. You bite one, as soldiers have done for centuries. It's soft. It shouldn't be soft. Silver is hard. This coin is mostly copper, a base metal plated with a whisper of silver. The government says it's worth the same, but you know, in your gut, it's a lie. The bread, the meat, the wine back in the camp town, they all cost twice what they did a decade ago. Your life savings, your pension, the value of your blood and sweat is evaporating in your hands. This isn't an invasion, it's a quiet, internal rot, and it doomed the greatest empire the world had ever known. This is the genesis of the pattern. The Roman denarius wasn't just money, it was a covenant of trust. Introduced in 211 BC, it started as 4.5 grams of pure, shining silver. For centuries, that purity was sacrosanct. A Roman citizen from Egypt to Gaul knew that a denarius was a denarius. This trust allowed Rome to build an empire of 60 million people, to field legions that could march for years, to create a common economic space across 3 continents. But empires are expensive beasts, constantly hungry, and their appetite for money is infinite. The first crack appeared with Emperor Nero in 54 AD. Facing a fiscal crisis, he did what every desperate government does. He cheated. He ordered the mints to reduce the silver content from 100% to 90%. It was a small, manageable debasement. He could now mint 11 coins with the silver that used to make 10. It was a hidden tax, a secret inflation, and it worked. No one revolted. The system absorbed the shock. And in that moment, a deadly precedent was set. The real horror, however, is how this story accelerates. It never happens all at once. It's a slow, boiling frog of financial betrayal. By the time of Emperor Caracalla in 215 AD, the denarius was a pathetic half-silver, half-copper hybrid. But the true collapse came in the 3rd century, a period of such chaos we call it the crisis of the 3rd century. Imagine the shock of a Roman merchant in 270 AD. Emperor Claudius Gothicus has just died of the plague, and the new emperor, Aurelian, is trying to hold the fragmenting empire together. You receive a shipment of Egyptian grain priced at 1,000 denarii, but the coins you're offered are a joke. They are so devoid of silver that they are literally bronze coins with a silver wash so thin it wears off in a month. Research by historians like Joseph Peden shows that by this point, the silver content had plummeted to less than 2%. What cost 1 denarii in the time of Augustus now cost over 50. The money was dying.
The reliability of this process is terrifying. The government, utterly dependent on spending, had no choice but to keep debasing. They were trapped. They needed to pay the legions to stop the borders from collapsing. but to pay them, they had to destroy the very value of the payment. It's a suicide pact. We have records of soldiers rioting, not over pay, but over the quality of their pay. They demanded payment in gold solidi or in kind, in grain, oil, and weapons. The trust was gone. The entire sophisticated Roman economy, which included everything from complex loans to long-distance trade, seized up like an engine without oil. Farmers refused to sell their food for worthless metal. Tax collectors couldn't gather revenue because what they collected was trash. The state was being starved of its lifeblood by its own hand. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall in 476 AD because the Germanic tribes were so powerful. It fell because it could no longer pay its soldiers, feed its people, or fund its administration. The currency collapsed, and the empire, built upon that currency, collapsed with it. The pattern was established: imperial overreach, followed by unsustainable spending, leading to currency debasement, which creates hyperinflation, resulting in a loss of confidence and culminating in total collapse. Now, let's leap forward over 1,000 years. The scene shifts from the marble forums of Rome to the rolling decks of Spanish galleons, heavy with a new kind of curse. If Rome's story is one of slow, deliberate debasement, then Spain's is a story of a different kind of madness, the tragedy of too much. Imagine you are a Spanish noble in Seville, in the year 1600. You stand on the docks, watching the latest fleet arrive from the New World. The wealth is incomprehensible. Since the discovery of the mountain of silver at Potosi in 1545, Spain has become the sole superpower, flooding the world with white metal. Historians estimate that over 150,000 tons of silver were extracted from the Americas by the mid-1600s, doubling Europe's supply. You're living in the Golden Age. Your king, Philip II, rules an empire upon which the sun never sets. The Spanish dollar, the piece of 8, is the world's first global reserve currency, accepted from the markets of Beijing to the trading posts of Venice. You feel an unshakable joy, a sense of divine right and endless prosperity. You are at the top of the world. But here comes the shock, the cruel twist of economic law that Spain failed to understand. When you flood the world with money, you don't make yourself richer, you make money cheaper. This is the paradox of plenty. The sheer volume of silver pouring into Spain created massive inflation, a price revolution that swept across Europe. A simple loaf of bread that cost 1 silver real in 1500 might cost 10 by 1650. The silver hadn't changed, there was just so much of it that its value plummeted. Spain was like a lottery winner who believes the cash will never run out. They didn't build domestic industries, they didn't innovate. Why bother? They had Potosi. So they spent their seemingly endless wealth on endless wars against the Ottomans, the Dutch, and the English, and on lavish imports of goods from countries that were building their industries, like France and England. The silver would arrive in Seville and, like water through a sieve, flow straight out to their rivals.
This leads to the most jaw-dropping case study in imperial incompetence, the sovereign default. King Philip II, the ruler of the world's richest empire, went bankrupt. Not once, but 4 times, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. Let that sink in. The man who controlled a mountain of silver could not pay his bills. The debt, inherited and expanded, became a monster he could not feed. When he defaulted, he shattered the trust of his Genoese and German bankers. Interest rates on Spanish debt skyrocketed, making the problem even worse. The government's response? Debased the currency, of course. They introduced a worthless copper coin called the vellon and tried to legislate that it was equal in value to silver. The people, of course, weren't fools. They rejected it. Gresham's law took hold. Bad money drives out good. People hoarded the good silver coins and spent the worthless copper, further accelerating the economic collapse. By the mid-1600s, Spain was a hollowed-out shell, a cautionary tale of how a river of silver can lead to a desert of bankruptcy. The pattern held with brutal reliability, massive wealth followed by fiscal irresponsibility and war, leading to currency inflation and sovereign default, which destroyed confidence and led to imperial decline. We have seen the pattern born in Rome and confirmed in Spain. But the most terrifying example, the one that holds the clearest mirror to our own time, is the fall of the British Empire. This is the story of how a financial system, the most sophisticated and global the world had ever seen, unraveled in a single generation. And it all started with a simple, trusted promise that a pound sterling was, quite literally, worth its weight in gold. But what happens when that promise is broken? Now we will witness the stunningly rapid fall of the British pound, a collapse that proves the final stage of this pattern isn't a slow decline, but a sudden, devastating plunge. You will see how the world's bank became a beggar and discover the single precise event that signaled the end of their empire, an event that has already begun to happen in the United States today.
The sun never set on the British Empire, but its financial system was built on a foundation of gold, and that foundation was about to crack. Imagine you are a London banker in the autumn of 1931. For 2 centuries, the pound sterling has been the bedrock of global commerce, a symbol of unshakable stability. The phrase, "as good as sterling," is a universal guarantee. Your wealth, your investments, the very prestige of your nation are tied to the solemn promise that any note can be walked into the Bank of England and exchanged for a fixed, certain amount of shining gold. This isn't just economics, it's a religion. And then, with a single announcement, the faith is shattered. The government, paralyzed by the Great Depression and a run on its gold reserves, suspends convertibility. The pound is cut loose from gold. In an instant, the covenant is broken. The reliable, timeless symbol of British power is revealed to be just paper, its value now subject to the whims of politicians and the panic of the markets. The trust that took centuries to build evaporated in a single day. This was not the first betrayal, but it was the most profound. The true rot had set in with the cataclysm of World War I. To grasp the scale of the financial hemorrhage, consider this shocking fact. In 1914, Britain's national debt was a manageable £650 million. Just 5 years later, after the industrial-scale slaughter of the Great War, it had exploded to over £7 billion. The empire had literally bankrupted itself to survive. The first temporary abandonment of the gold standard during the war was a necessary sin, but the psychological damage was done. The money had been printed, the debt incurred. The empire was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The fatal error came in 1925 when Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, in a move driven by pride and nostalgia, returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war parity. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The pound was now wildly overvalued, making British exports impossibly expensive and plunging the nation's industries into a deep depression years before the rest of the world. It was a desperate attempt to cling to a vanished era of dominance, and it strangled the real economy in the process. The final, humiliating collapse of British financial hegemony, however, came not from a war of bullets, but from the war that followed. World War II left Britain victorious, but utterly hollowed out. Cities were smoldering ruins, the economy was shattered, and the national debt had soared to an unimaginable 270% of GDP. The empire was a patient on life support, and the United States held the plug. This sets the stage for a quiet, diplomatic event that was more consequential than any battle: the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. Here, in a hotel in New Hampshire, the American century officially began and the British century was formally euthanized. The pound sterling, the venerable monarch of global finance, was dethroned.
The US dollar was crowned the new world reserve currency, backed by the only gold left in significant quantity, America's. The British delegation, led by the brilliant but defeated John Maynard Keynes, fought desperately for a different outcome, but they had no leverage. They had the debt, the Americans had the gold. The pattern was executing with chilling precision. Victory in war had masked a fatal economic defeat.
What followed was a slow-motion autopsy of an empire. The reliability of the pound was gone, and with it, the glue that held the empire together. In 1947, a doomed attempt to make the pound convertible again triggered a massive run on the currency, draining Britain's meager dollar reserves and forcing a humiliating reversal within weeks. Then came the devaluations, the official admission of weakness. In 1949, the pound was slashed by 30% against the dollar. The shock for the ordinary Briton was profound. Savings, pensions, and the nation's international standing were instantly diminished. But the death knell sounded in 1967. The British government, besieged by yet another currency crisis, was forced to devalue the pound once more, from $2.80 to $2.40. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, went on television to famously tell the public that this does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse, is worth any less. It was a transparent, pathetic lie, and everyone knew it. The loss of confidence was now total. The currency was in a death spiral. And then the empire itself simply vanished. It didn't fall to conquest, it was liquidated. India, the jewel in the crown, was granted independence in 1947. The Suez Crisis in 1956 was the final, brutal revelation of this new reality. When Britain, in a fit of imperial nostalgia, invaded Egypt alongside France and Israel, they were not met with military defeat on the battlefield. They were met with a financial ultimatum from the US Treasury, which threatened to sell its sterling bonds and collapse the British currency. The invasion collapsed within days. The message was clear. London no longer controlled its own destiny. The empire could no longer be funded. Colony after colony broke away, not because of military weakness, but because the economic power required to hold them was gone. By the 1970s, Britain was a cautionary tale, a nation with 25% inflation begging the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The empire that had dominated the globe for 2 centuries had been dismantled within 30, not by armies, but by a collapsing currency. The pattern was now undeniable, a 3-part tragedy written in the ledgers of Rome, Spain, and Britain. Which brings us to the inevitable American sequel. Every single warning light that flashed red in the final days of Rome and Britain is now blindingly bright on the American dashboard. The United States is following the hidden pattern, step for step, with a fidelity that is both breathtaking and terrifying. We achieved dominance, just as they did. We built a global military presence that dwarfs Rome's, just as they did. And we have entered the stage of unsustainable spending and currency debasement with an audacity that would make Emperor Nero blush.
Let's start with the primal sin, the breaking of the promise. In 1971, President Nixon, facing a run on American gold reserves from nervous European allies, closed the gold window. The US dollar, the successor to the pound, was officially cut loose from any tangible backing. It became a pure fiat currency, a faith-based initiative. The Nixon shock was our 1931 moment. The covenant was broken. But there was a temporary reprieve, a devil's bargain known as the petrodollar. By convincing Saudi Arabia to price all oil sales in dollars, we created an artificial, structural demand for our currency that prolonged its life for decades. This allowed us to commit the same imperial sins with impunity for a time. Now, consider the numbers.
Because the scale of our debauchery makes history's previous empires look like frugal shopkeepers. The US national debt, a seemingly abstract concept, is the clearest measure of our overextension. In 1980, it was $900 billion. Today, it has exploded past $34 trillion. This isn't just a number, it is a monument to consumption we cannot afford. But the modern equivalent of clipping Roman coins is even more insidious. It's called quantitative easing. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars out of thin air, digitally debasing the currency to prop up the system. During the COVID pandemic alone, we printed over $4 trillion in 2 years, more money than in the first 2 centuries of the Republic combined. The initial joy of free money and stimulus checks has been predictably followed by the shock of inflation. Just like the Roman soldier discovered his denarius was soft, Americans are now discovering their dollar buys less at the grocery store, at the gas pump, and for their homes. The most advanced stage of the pattern is now beginning, the loss of confidence. For decades, the world had no alternative to the dollar, but that era is over. The BRICS nations, led by China, are executing a deliberate, long-term strategy to dethrone the dollar. They are building alternative financial infrastructure, signing bilateral trade deals in local currencies, and stockpiling gold at a historic pace. Since 2008, the dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from over 70% to under 60%, and the decline is accelerating. This is the exact same flight from a reigning currency that happened to the pound sterling after Bretton Woods. The world is quietly, methodically, preparing for a post-dollar world.
So, where does this leave us? The emotional journey through this history must end not in despair, but in clarity. The purpose of recognizing this pattern is not to succumb to fatalism, but to be shaken from our slumber. The shock of Rome's fall, the tragic waste of Spain's wealth, and the stunning speed of Britain's decline are not mere stories. They are blueprints. They teach us that collapse is not a random accident. It is the logical, mathematical consequence of specific, repeatable actions. The empires of history did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they believed the rules of economics did not apply to them. They believed they were the exception. The United States is not the exception. We are the sequel. The hidden pattern of collapse is not a theory, it is a law. And as the debt grows, as the money printer hums, and as the world diversifies away from our currency, the final act of this story is being written. The question is no longer if the pattern will complete itself, but how we will choose to navigate its inevitable conclusion. Will we be the generation that watched the warning signs of history and did nothing, or the one that had the courage to see the truth and act before it was too late? The ghost of every fallen empire is watching, waiting for the answer.